So today is the part of the process that you've all been waiting for. We figured out all the theory, we know it's all going to work. So today I'm going to start building parts to the lock that are going to get installed in the lock, and they're actually going to stay there. And in the next few videos I'm just going to keep adding more and more pieces until the lock is done. I have the bolt roughed out and it's temporarily installed here, and that's actually going to be the subject of the next video, but I have it here because I need to show you the relationship between the bolt and the wards, which are what I'm building this week. And wards are simply obstacles that the key has to fit around to be able to get to the mechanism. So this horseshoe-shaped piece in the center of the lock is the ward. The hole that you see in the center of this horseshoe-shaped ring is going to have a pin, and that's also part of the ward system because now the key has to be drilled out as a cylinder so it can fit over the pin, and the bit of the key needs to be cut out in the shape of the ward so that it can fit around it and move the bolt from side to side. And as I mentioned earlier, this is how locks were built for several hundred years. They consisted of a pretty basic mechanism and then wards which provided the obstacle and kept keys that didn't belong in that lock from working through and getting to that simple mechanism. And they did a pretty good job of keeping the wrong key from using the lock, but of course anybody that wanted to take the time to figure out how the wards were set up in the lock could easily cut something that would bypass those wards and open the lock. So even the most complex lock in that day was pretty low security by today's standards. So that's what I'm doing today, and I kept it as a separate video because it's a totally optional part of this lock. If you don't see the need or you have no intentions of installing wards in your lock, then you can just skip this whole video and pick up the process next week without missing anything. The ward I'm building for this lock is pretty straightforward. It's just a circular ring that has a circular detail at the top edge of the ring that the key needs to fit around. So the first thing I need to do is basically hammer a nail head on one edge of the bar. So I've cut out an L-shaped detail here, and the thin section is what I'm going to be riveting back into that nail head. I've left the bar extra long here so I have the leverage to make it easier to bend around in a circle. Also, I'm going to be mounting this horizontal in the vise, and the extra length is going to give me the grab that I need to keep it from sliding sideways when I rivet that head. And as always, when you're riveting something like this, just go very slowly, take very light hammer blows, and just work at it gradually. I should warn you that the vise that I'm using is my portable vise that I have on a mobile bench, so it's on wheels, so you're going to see it moving around a fair amount as I'm working through this process. And once the head is shaped, just take a file and profile it into whatever shape you want to use. Just keep in mind that that shape also needs to be cut out of the key bit, so don't make it too complicated for your first ward. I'm just using a circle. Hopefully I'm going to be able to drill a hole through the bit and everything will work out fine. Now the problem with wards is they need to be perfectly round and perfectly concentric with the pivot hole for the key. So if you don't have something that'll fit the lock that you're making, you're going to need to make a mandrel to use as a form for the ward. I got lucky because I have a 3/4 inch drill and it's built with a little tiny step before it gets to the shaft, and that little step happens to be exactly the right size that I need for the lock that I'm building. So I'm going to use that step on my 3/4 inch drill for the final shaping of the ward, and I went out and bought a 11/16 drill, and I'm going to use the step on that one to do the preforming, because the problem with shaping a ward is getting the initial bend tight enough so it doesn't have a flat spot before it gets into the main curve. So forming that on a smaller mandrel is going to give you that tighter radius that you need, and then later on you can expand that into the final diameter. And this is how I'm going to clamp it in the vise. That head detail needs to stay above the shoulder of the drill. And this is one of those processes where if you have somebody kicking around to give you a hand setting this up, it's really going to make it a lot easier. And this soft jaw did eventually work pretty well when I was done juggling everything around, because it allowed me to put enough pressure on everything to hold everything in place and make the fine adjustments that I needed before clamping it down to make the bend. And then of course once I had the initial bend set up, then I could use the curve of the piece to cradle the drill bit and work my way around that way. Here I'm just hacksawing down the sides to cut out the tenons that I'm going to use to rivet the wards to the back plate. Again, this vise is on wheels, that's why it's moving around so much. And then as always, just clean everything up with a file. Here I have the prototype key blank that I made in the first video to make some rough calculations, and I'm going to be turning it into a scribing tool that I'm going to need to scribe the layout lines onto the back plate to position the ward correctly. The two marks that I have laid out with a Sharpie are the inside and the outside edge of the ward. So I'm going to use a chisel to cut a groove at that location so I can later file those to a point and scribe two concentric lines that I'm going to be able to use to line up that ward. The chisel's a little bit wider than the metal that I'm using, so that's going to leave me with two scribe lines that are going to be visible when I lay the piece on the back plate. And here I'm just using a file to create the points that I need. So here's the scriber roughed in. On the far right I have the pivot point for the key, and then the 2 points in the center are the scribe lines for the ward, and the point on the far left is the outside edge of the key. So the bolt needs to fit around that scribe line. I'm just using a permanent marker as a layout die, and I'm just working my way around with the scriber until I get scribe lines where I need them. This is the setup that I'm using to scribe the location of the ward onto the back plate. The rubberized screwdriver handle allows me to have a firm grip on the ward and apply pressure downwards, but still keep my hand out of the way, and the hooked scriber can fit underneath the edge of the wards and scribe the location of the tenons. Here I've drilled out one of the tenons, and I'm using a narrow chisel to square up the hole to fit the tenon. Once that's done, I'll be inserting that one tenon into the hole, and I'll use that to lock the ward in place to be able to scribe the location of the other side. And then I just drill and chisel out the hole the same way I did for the other side. And then once you have it where you want it, you just rivet it down the same way you would anything else. So that's the procedure that I go through when I'm building and installing a fairly simple ward. And this video is purely intended to show that process. If you need to add a ward to a lock to be historically accurate or something like that, this is the process that I would use to build it. If I was building a lock for myself to use on a regular basis, either in demonstrations or reenactments, I would not bother putting wards into that lock, because wards really do complicate things when you misplace the key. And you want to get that lock open without spending a lot of time making a new key. Without the wards in the way, you can use just about any kind of a bent wire and get the lock open quickly without damaging it. So in my opinion, that's a much better way to go if you're planning on building a lock and using it on a regular basis. You'll still have a lock that looks great and opens and closes with the key. You just won't have the wards complicating things. Hi, I'm Dennis, and thanks for watching. If you're interested in supporting this channel and you can spare $2.50 every month, click on the Patreon logo at the bottom of the screen. I'd really like to be able to expand the content of this channel and turn it into the best resource for anyone wanting to learn traditional crafts, but I need your help to get there. Thank you.